Hi, I'm Dave, and this is Dave's Worldview. The title of my video today is It's Time to Be Outraged. You know, it's my position that self-titled progressives have used manufactured outrage as a tool to push our country so far to the left that we now teeter on the precipice of a societal disaster. And now I find myself outraged. And I'm not going to be quiet while progressives continue to push policies that undermine our humanity and our liberties. If we as a people don't find our inner outrage and the boldness necessary to take a stand against so-called progressive morality, then our children and grandchildren will live in a very dark society that no longer permits dissenting opinions on policies that may damage the fabric of that society. This message covers a couple of very sensitive subjects. So before I get any deeper into my message, I want to say that I have compassion on anyone that has been the living victim of the choice to abort their baby, the mothers and the fathers. And I also have compassion for those that feel like they are born into the wrong body and suffer with transgenderism or gender dysphoria. I take issue not with those who are the victims, but with those whose policies create more victims and in the process devalue human life, which I believe is created in the image of God. So recently, Joe Biden, he called Vladimir Putin a soulless killer. Now, Biden's choice of words and air of moral superiority to that of Vladimir Putin, however you say his name, motivated me to spend my time and effort to produce this video. Joe Biden and the Democratic Party advocate for abortion till the day of birth for any reason. Besides the United States, only communist North Korea and communist China allow abortions till the day of birth for any reason. Any rational human being should realize that killing a baby old enough to live outside the womb is murder. Not only does good old Joe, or nice guy Joe as the press likes to call him, approve of this barbarity, but like most of the Democratic Party, he finds it necessary to use American taxpayer money to fund abortions, not only in our country, but in other countries around the world. The Democratic Party that Mr. Biden supposedly leads is also trying to pass legislation that would force medical workers to perform abortions by outlawing the conscience provisions that permit medical workers to opt out of participation. I know this is going to sound very disturbing, but in my opinion, forcing someone to participate in an abortion would be as bad as forcing someone to participate in pedophilia or to take part in bestiality. You know, forgive me for being so blunt, but, as a former medical worker myself, I know of no other way to describe how atrocious and despicable I think it would be to force someone to participate in an abortion. So, summing it up, Joe Biden, the Democratic Party, advocate for legal abortion till the day of birth for any reason. They use taxpayer funds to pay for abortions in the United States and overseas. And if they can pass the so-called Equality Act, they would force medical workers to perform and participate in abortions. Now, while I would never call anyone a soulless killer as Mr. Biden did Vladimir Putin, I do not consider Mr. Biden morally superior to Mr. Putin when he advocates for abortion to the day of birth for any reason. We should be outraged by the Democratic Party's total lack of respect for human life and their willingness to violate the consciences of those who oppose the mass murder of unborn babies. We should also be outraged by Joe Biden and progressive policies when it comes to gender dysphoria and the transgender movement. Summarizing the words of Kathy Grace Duncan, a woman that transitioned to a man and then detransitioned back to a woman, gender dysphoria goes way back and starts at a really young age. These are people that feel like they were born into the wrong body their whole lives. In contrast to gender dysphoria, the transgender movement, as she describes it, is the kids that when they reach puberty, they are like, maybe I should be the opposite sex. Mostly young girls fall into this category, but there are exceptions. There are many points at which I would disagree with Joe Biden and the progressives when it comes to this issue, but I will limit my discussion to those I find the most outrageous. First and foremost, studies suggest that between 75 to 95% of people no longer struggle with gender dysphoria after they go through puberty. So the idea of giving puberty blockers or hormonal treatments to children before they go through puberty should be considered child abuse. Secondly, transgenderism is another area where the progressives are prone to use propaganda and censorship to avoid the truth to push a dangerous agenda. Let me give you some examples. Brown University did a study on sudden onset gender dysphoria. The study showed clusters of preteen and early teenage girls that shared social media contact coming out as transgendered. This was a new phenomena that the study authors suggested warranted additional study. But under pressure from progressive transgender activists, Brown University pulled their peer-reviewed study. So basically, we are in a situation where universities can't even question the massive increase in children presenting with transgender dysphoria. Another example of censorship. Amazon quietly removed a book titled When Harry Became Sally, responding to the transgender movement. The author, who is president of the Washington-based think tank Ethics and Public Policy Center, only learned about the move when people informed him that they couldn't find his book. And anyhow, yet another example of censorship, and there are many more. Target removed another book, Irreversible Damage, The Transgender Craze Seducing Our Daughters, authored by Abigail Schreier. After a progressive activist complained the book questions transgender ideology, especially the concept of irreversible hormonal and surgical experimentation on minors. The book does not deny that some people struggle with gender dysphoria, but actually deals with the subject of sudden onset gender dysphoria that Brown University did not have the moral courage to deal with. Quoting from an article by Madeline Osborne, she says this: Schreier's book is not about sexual orientation or transgender adults. It examines the growing social phenomena of transgender identification among teen girls and how underage medical transitions can be a form of self-harm. Girls who might have encouraged each other in bulimia, anorexia, or cutting are today deciding they have gender dysphoria, pushing for hormones and surgeries and easily obtaining them, writes Schreier. Target was not the first corporate entity to censor Schreier's book. When the book was released in June, Amazon, not surprisingly, barred Schreier's publisher from running ads for the book because it contained copy and content that infers or claims to diagnose, treat, or question sexual orientation. Now I want to read from an article by Debbie Hayton. You can find it at debbiehayton.com, Hayton. Anyhow, she says in her article, she says, Cara Bell, now 23, is taking legal action against the Tavistock and Portman National Health Services Foundation Trust, which runs NHS England's only gender identity clinic for children. More than 2,700 children, some as young as 10, were referred to the clinic last year, a 20-fold rise over the past decade. Many, like Bell, are quickly put onto puberty blockers that can cause dangerous side effects. Bell, who now regrets taking the drugs as a teenager, said this. She said, there needs to be a stop to prescribing puberty blockers to children under 18. Bell, however, is just one of many girls across the world who have been misled into thinking that they can become boys and that the process is safe and easy. With decisions driven by social media influencers and peer pressure and encouraged by right-on teachers, parents have been left bewildered by the sudden change in their daughters and the catastrophic effect on their mental health and ultimately their ability to have children of their own. As Sheila Jeffries, the feminist academic, has warned, the transgendering of children now is simply a form of eugenics, which shares similarities with the forced sterilization of homosexuals, criminals, the disabled, and people with mental health problems in the early 20th century. The same article also contains a very informative story from a female physician named Jennifer from Massachusetts, whose 12-year-old daughter got caught up in the sudden onset gender dysphoria phenomena. The The school her daughter attended was pushing her daughter to transition, but fortunately, COVID lockdowns allowed her daughter a reprieve from the pressure she faced at school, and her daughter ended up changing her mind when the facts were properly explained to her. Yet another story describes the experience of a physician, Lisa Littman, who was working as a public health consultant in Rhode Island in 2018 when she published an observational study of the phenomena that gripped Jennifer's 12-year-old daughter, rapid onset gender dysphoria. Littman told me that after my research article was published, some local clinicians wrote a letter to the leadership of the organization I was working with and demanded I be fired immediately from my consulting job. Despite the fact that her job was unconnected with gender dysphoria, Littman recalled how the leadership succumbed to the pressure. I was informed that they decided not to renew my contract for the next year because as an organization, they needed to be neutral. They believed that renewing my contract would be taking my side, firing me immediately would be taking the letter writer's side, and that not renewing my contract would be the neutral option. It's almost unbelievable. I highly recommend that you read the whole article. I'm going to put it on my video. The dogmatic militancy surrounding transgender activism has reached the point that parents have been arrested for trying to block their children from gender transitioning while minors. The Equality Act that was passed by the House of Representatives along party lines by the Democrats and that is now under consideration by the Senate would remove the rights of parents to block minors from transitioning. With studies showing that transgender people, even with hormonal therapy and surgical transitioning, having a 20 to 25 times higher suicide rate, maybe the headlong rush towards transitioning favored by the most radical transgender activists in the Democratic Party needs to be reevaluated. At the very least, puberty blockers and hormonal treatment should be prohibited until after the child experiences puberty, especially since, as I mentioned earlier, the vast majority of children no longer struggle with gender dysphoria after puberty. We should be outraged by the Democratic Party's position and use of propaganda and censorship when it comes to the issue of transgenderism and gender dysphoria. We should also be outraged by the lies that the Democratic Party is using to change how we vote in America, especially coming on the heels of a highly disputed election. In the wake of the Bush-Gore hanging Chad election debacle in 2000, a bipartisan commission on election integrity in 2005, founded by former Democrat President Jimmy Carter and Republican James A. Baker, came to the conclusion that in order to have election integrity, we need to have voter ID, avoid mail-in ballots as much as possible, and avoid ballot harvesting. Through the very deceptively titled For the People Act, or H.R. 1, the Democrats are now trying to put into law everything that the 2005 Commission on Federal Election Reform said should be outlawed, and outlaw everything that the Commission said should be required. H.R. 1 bears no resemblance to the bipartisan recommendations of the Election Reform Initiative in 2001 or those of the Commission on Federal Election Reform in 2005. Quoting George Liebman, author of numerous works on law and history, he said, "Detection of election fraud depends on access by neutral observers to those casting votes, made impossible when votes are cast in the privacy of homes or ballots are retrieved from mailboxes or doorsteps. The spirit animating the proposed federal legislation is sufficiently indicated by the support given by the Speaker of the House and more than 120 House Democrats to allow 16-year-olds to vote." The last thing the supporters of H.R. 1 want is a mature, unmanipulated, and responsible electorate. End of quote. The Democrats want to make it illegal to ask for voter ID despite Rasmussen polling that shows that support for voter ID laws has actually increased since 2018 and now stands at 75%. According to Rasmussen reports, as the U.S. Senate considers legislation that would revamp America's election laws, voters still overwhelmingly support laws requiring that voters show identification before casting a ballot. A new Rasmussen report National Telephone and Online Survey finds that 75% of likely U.S. voters believe voters should be required to show photo identification, such as a driver's license, before being allowed to vote. Only 21% are opposed to such a requirement. Whatever the Democrats are trying to do in the area of election integrity obviously does not have the support of the American people. But once again, they will cry racism and voter suppression and try to appear to be the moral majority with their manufactured outrage. The concerns of the American people are not the issue to those with globalist ambitions. These people are globalist. I think they're communist. You know, they're going to be part of the party. They'll be taken care of. That's the way it is in a communist country, or in a communist, global communist country, whatever you want to call it. I went into a little more depth on the issue of election integrity, transgenderism, gender dysphoria, and abortion in order to make a reasoned argument that those of us on the other side of these three issues are the ones that should be outraged. For the sake of brevity, I'm going to add some other issues that we should be outraged about without going into in as much detail. I have covered most of these in previous videos. We should be outraged that the majority of journalists are actually activists that act like unelected representatives of the Democratic Party. We should be outraged about that. We should be outraged that very few Democrats have a problem with media censorship and propaganda because they know that it favors them. We should be outraged that some Democrats in the House of Representatives, this is a truth, you can look it up, they tried to pressure cable providers to not carry the few conservative news media sites that currently remain. You know, conservatives didn't try to remove CNN from cable. Even though CNN, their content is virtually nothing but lies, the inflaming of racial and other societal divisions, and globalist propaganda. But we didn't try to censor them or shut them down. We should be outraged that Democratic Party leaders, including Kamala Harris, supported Marxist revolutionaries that were burning American cities last year. Support that including bailing suspects out of jail so they could go back to looting and burning in our cities. We should be outraged that the Democratic Party uses racism as a tool to divide Americans, to advance their leftist goals, and build their voter base. We should be outraged when leftists use left-leaning fact checkers to check facts like PolitiFact. Some of these sites have been purposely set up to mislead the American people. We should be outraged that leftists are teaching our children to hate America in our public schools, colleges, and universities. You know, I could go on, but I think, you get the message. We are the ones that should be outraged, not the left. Okay, it's a tool that they use to get what they want. We have to say no more. Anyhow, this isn't about politics to me. This is about our children and grandchildren, my grandchildren. This is about what kind of society allows the dismembering and killing of babies that are old enough to live outside the womb. This is about people that want to gender confuse our children and grandchildren in our public schools by telling them that gender is a social construct. And then these same people want to remove parental rights so they can give our children irreversible hormonal therapies and surgically mutilate and sterilize them. The comparison to Nazi Germany is certainly overused, but it definitely applies in this situation. Who would have believed that we would ever see this in America? And the Joe Bidens and Hillary Clintons of the world, they have the temerity to say that we are the dregs and deplorables of society. I don't think so. We have the truth, and it is time to boldly declare it. They talk about unity. Make no mistake, the only way to have unity with today's Democratic Party is complete surrender. Even if you accepted everything that they stand for today, ask yourself this question: what would you have to accept tomorrow to have peace with them? How do you have unity with people that are willing to allow the killing of babies old enough to live outside the womb? People that want to pass laws to force medical workers to kill babies? How do you have unity with people that want to gender confuse your children in public schools and then take away parental rights so that they can put your child on hormonal therapy and eventually surgically mutilate and sterilize your child before they go through puberty? There is no place for unity with the modern Democratic Party. Their goal is subjugation, not compromise. That's why they try to destroy anyone that dares to stand in their way. It's time that we take a stand. It's time to be bold, and it's time to speak up and speak out while you still can. Jesus said that we should love our enemies. He did not say that we wouldn't have any enemies or that we shouldn't have any enemies. The Bible says that we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers, and people make that argument that, as Christians, we're not supposed to get involved in politics. Well, I've seen the face of evil and I believe in these demonic powers. But while I realize that our battle isn't against flesh and blood, there is a time to stand up against unjust government and unjust laws and the people that make them, especially when that government and those people seek to do harm to our children. The love we have for our children and our grandchildren should compel us to be bold to speak out against the Democratic Party's agenda and their plans for a godless America. I recognize there are many atheists that have a moral compass far superior to today's Democratic Party. However, secular morality as practiced by today's Democratic Party has become untethered from reality and is now a threat to our nation. While the Democrats have taken to calling themselves socialists, their tactics are those of communists. I have seen videos and talked personally to Americans that immigrated here from communist countries. They all say that what they are seeing from today's Democratic Party is what they experienced with communism. And while Marxist educators have painted a romantic picture of socialism and communism to deceive our youth, I have never heard of anyone that has lived in a communist country that bragged about how good they had it before they came to America. So it is my opinion that some in the Democratic Party are now capable of nearly any atrocity known to human history. The church in Germany stood by and refused to confront the ideology of Hitler and the Nazis. That same evil spirit is rising up in America. And please don't choose to be silent at this time. You know what? We need to make a stand. If we don't make a stand now, our kids are going to live under the thumb of these crazed lunatics, basically is what they are, that have lost touch with reality. So I know that sounds a little harsh, but I don't know how else to describe this. I don't know how else to describe this. This is nuts. And you're thinking in your mind, this is nuts. Well, I'm here to tell you, you're thinking right. So anyhow, this is Dave. This is Dave's Worldview. It's time to be bold. It's time to be courageous. It's time to speak out and say we're not going to take it anymore, and you're not going to do these things to our children. So thanks for watching Dave's Worldview, and God bless you and have a great day.